Vertically scanning through these answer choices reveals plenty of differences at the beginning of the answer choice, at the end of the answer choices, but the easiest catch is the difference that can be spotted close to the commas. In A, B, C, D, and E, we have a split between including and which includes. Now, this is an easy point of attack because this including is acting as an additive to these nations. So it's adding extra information for these nations. Now, the which is also fine because it's acting as a relative clause to these nations, but we see that the verb here is includes, which is a singular verb, but the noun here is a plural noun. So it shouldn't have been includes, it should have been include. So B goes off by the noun and verb agreement. The same mistake is there in D, so D goes off as well. Now, to work efficiently with the rest of the answer choices, we can try to read these choices without the additive phrase because this additive phrase is just extra information. And since it's between commas, these can be read around. So if we see the remainder of the sentence, we see if the nations were to trim output, if the output of the nations would be trimmed, and if the nations trim output. Now A and E look straightforward, but we can see that in C, if we write it as output would be trimmed by, this is bringing about an unnecessary passive construction. See, the logic just has to read that the nations would trim output. But if we write it in the passive form, the output of these nations would be trimmed by a certain amount, but would be trimmed by whom actually? So we know that between an active and a passive construction, GMAT would prefer the active construction. So C can be eliminated. Now both A and E are in the active voice, they both can work. But one difference that we can see is this comma but here and this directly saying only if the nations. Now when you read the sentence, it seems like they both can work. But we really need to look into the logic and construction to make sure that we can eliminate with a proper reason here. Now this is where you can use the rest of the sentence to see exactly what the logic dictates. So if we go by the sentence in the non-underlined portion, we see that the logic actually reads that a reduction was expected, but they announced a reduction, but only if the nations were to trim output. So this is A's construction. Now in E, obviously we have the same thing until we get to the underlined portion, in which we don't have the but, and it directly says they announced a reduction only if the nations trim output. So we have a but here and another but here. Now even if this construction were to work, we need to check exactly what meaning is it conveying. Now we see a reduction was expected, but they announced a reduction, but only if the nations were to trim output. So in this case, this but is already conveying a contrast between these two things, and this but is conveying a contrast between these two things. Now if you check the meaning here, a reduction was expected, but they announced a reduction. So what exactly is contrasting between these two things? It would have been contrasting if they said a reduction was expected, but they did not announce a reduction. So this kind of makes for a very logical construction. But on the other hand, even though this but is present here, we can see that The second but is not present in the underlying portion. So if we go by that, a reduction was expected, but they announced a reduction only if the nation's trim output. So this whole thing would contrast with a reduction was expected, but they announced it only with a condition. And this makes for proper contrast in meaning. So A does not make sense. E is your right answer.